Welcome. This is our first recording in our 2012 series of interviews about the European Union from Bandura campus La Trobe University, and I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest from Sydney. Seien Sie herzlich willkommen, Herr Dr. Hartwich. Es ist mir eine große Freude und Ehre, dass Sie unserer Einladung gefolgt sind. Sie haben Wirtschaft und Rechtswissenschaft studiert, zwei Bereiche, die von entscheidender Bedeutung im heutigen Europa sind. Diese Bereiche würde ich gerne mit Ihnen heute diskutieren.
Wir können das auch auf Englisch machen.
I just wanted to show off that I can speak German. That was, and I defeated the whole thing by not being able to finish my last sentence. I just want to welcome you in Melbourne.
Great pleasure to be here again.
And
third time.
Third time, that's right.
3 years of Euro crisis together.
That's right. And you predicted 3 years ago that Europe is going to fall apart.
Yeah, I think I'm still right.
Well, it hasn't happened over the last 3 years.
Now we can go into that later.
We'll go into that. I should say what I said in German. You studied law, you studied economics, and in a sense, I think these are the two crucial areas that matter to Europe today. The economic crisis is focused on the Eurozone, but what we have discussed in our subject is also that the success of the European project is predicated on the idea that Europe works as a supranational legal order. And I suspect that that legal order is also undermined by the current crisis. But I mentioned you are originally from Germany, and I want to start with Germany, because Germany was there at the very beginning and is at the center of the crisis today still. So what was in it for Germany after the Second World War?
Well, you mentioned that you have to understand economics and law to understand the Euro crisis. Actually, I think you probably need a wider field of expertise to really understand what's going on. You probably have to have some psychology knowledge as well. You probably need to know some history. You need to know some politics. So there are many factors playing into the whole Euro crisis now. And I think we need all of these perspectives to understand how we got there. And so if you are asking then about Germany and how Germany got into the European Union, or first how it got into the European Economic Community, well, I think we have to go back quite a bit further than that. We have to go to the outcome of the First World War, actually, and see what happened then. Germany was punished, of course, for officially causing the First World War. The Versailles Treaty, they were trying to isolate Germany, humiliate it, weaken it strategically, and the whole thing, of course, as we know, completely backfired. And so after the Second World War, a different approach was needed, and instead of isolating and humiliating and punishing Germany, they were trying to integrate it. So it was a very close embrace from the French side, hugging the Germans so much that they couldn't move out anymore. But you still had them under control. So it looked very friendly, but actually they were still trying to contain Germany. I think that was one reason why Germany was integrated into this European framework after the Second World War. But I think there's a second reason as well, because you just have to remember the geopolitical situation after 1945, the beginning of the Cold War, the confrontation between East and West. And what we saw in both parts, both in the East and in the West, was a drive towards integration. You had that in the East, you had the Comic-Con, where they were trying to unite economically, and then in the West, they were trying that with the European Economic Community. On the military front, of course, same story, two systems, Warsaw Pact against NATO. And so this drive towards integration in the West actually also reinforced the drive towards the European Economic Community and then later on the European Union. So I think if you're really looking at the 1950s, there were two big factors at play. One was how to deal with Germany, defeated again after the Second World War, but trying to avoid the mistakes of the First World War, how to deal with that. And the other factor, definitely the Cold War. I would probably go as far as to say that the whole economic project, starting in the 50s, the Treaty of Rome, to me, that is really a child of the Cold War confrontation. And of course, it developed a dynamic of its own afterwards. So I wouldn't say that whatever happened afterwards is just driven by Cold War politics, far from it. But that was really the trigger for the whole project of European integration. And actually, we probably have to go even before the Treaty of Rome. The first attempt to integrate economically was the European Community for Coal and Steel.
That's right, and I was curious actually that I was curious to see why you chose the Treaty of Rome, because that in its own right has some impact on our way of understanding the European project. If you date it back to the Treaty of Rome that created the European Economic Community, that is March 1957, right, when it was signed, then you focus more on the common market, right? Mm-hmm. And if you go back to the Treaty of Paris that created the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, you are talking more about the political project of European unity, right?
Well, I think when you look at coal and steel, of course you're looking at two crucial industries at the time. You're looking at energy and you're looking at defense, because whoever controlled coal and steel had control over these two vital fields. And especially after the experiences of the Second World War and the First World War, it was crucial for the French to keep some degree of control over their neighbor to the east. They wanted to see what the Germans were doing on the energy front. They wanted to see what they're doing in terms of potential to rearm after 1945. And so if you have a closer eye on coal and steel, that gives them some degree of control, and the Germans would never be able to really go down that path again, and so the French could keep a closer eye on their neighbor.
John Gillingham, a British historian of European integration, stresses the difference between the two treaties in terms of their various commitments to the idea of free market. And for him, the Treaty of Rome is much more in line with that kind of neoliberal view of free market ultimately benefiting everyone, while the Treaty of Paris that created the European Coal and Steel Community was more inspired by Jean Monnet and his more dirigist approach to economy. Would you share that view?
Probably, and it's potentially it's quite logical, because if you look at 1957, that was the peak of the economic miracle in Germany. So that was, of course, a time when such ideas were extremely popular, because everybody could see that they work, and they worked extremely well for West Germany. Germany had a remarkable economic success story after 45, thanks to the neoliberal reforms of Ludwig Erhard when he was economics minister. Yeah. And so in 1957, these free market ideas driving forward this European project of economic integration must have been extremely popular, because everybody could see that they worked in Germany.
So that would be the next question. I mean, we kind of worked out what was in it for Germany. So we focused more on the external pressure that Germany was exposed to. But what kind of Europe has Germany pursued? Now, going back to that initial stage, and you just mentioned Ludwig Erhard.
Well, if you ask what's in it for Germany, there's another factor, of course. Yes. After 1945, as you can imagine, it was extremely unpopular to be German. Nobody wanted to be German anymore. It was something to be deeply ashamed and embarrassed of. Some kind of disease that you rather want to hide from your neighbors.
Yes, in fact, Germans still behave like
that. I think they're getting... Well, I don't know. I think the Germans are slowly getting more normal and they're becoming more at ease with their own identity. But for a long, long time in post-war history in Germany, I think that was one of the crucial problems for the Germans. They didn't quite know who they were and who they wanted to be. One thing was quite clear: they didn't want to be German, because that was just embarrassing.
So Europe offered an escape route, basically.
It offered them some kind of substitute identity, an Ersatz-Identität. There was a test that you could apply, actually. If you ever met someone who kind of strikes you as somehow German, you know, just ask him where he's from. And if he then says he's European, then you know that he's German. But no other European nationality would have done it that same way. So, I mean, a Brit certainly would have never said that I'm European. Of course, he was British or English or Welsh or Scottish. I think the same is true for the Italians, for the Spanish, for the Austrians, for the Danes. No other European nation probably self-identifies as much as European as the Germans do. And for the obvious reason that being German was simply too unappealing. It was something that they rather wanted to hide, and that they were not really coming to grips with what it really meant. I think in more recent years, it has become easier for the Germans to deal with that, because that generation that was responsible for Nazi time and for the Second World War and for the Holocaust, they have died out, and the generations in Germany now are, of course, aware of their history. They take this as not so much as a burden, but as a responsibility. So I think a repeat of what happened between 1933 and 1945 in Germany is extremely unlikely, because there is a collective memory. And yet they wouldn't feel personally responsible, and therefore they are a bit more relaxed, just embracing their own culture again, which you could probably see, I think, in its clearest expression in the Football World Cup in 2006, when for the first time in decades you saw German flags in every street, on every corner, and that showed you that the Germans had actually kind of found peace with themselves again, which is actually, I think, quite a positive for them, but it took them a long time.
Now, there is one aspect that you mentioned that we haven't addressed it explicitly enough, and that is that, well, Europe was divided, but Germany itself was divided into West Germany and East Germany. And when we talk about the project of European unity, then we, of course, focus on West Germany, even though we talk about Germany. Now, this changed dramatically through the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the idea for a common currency that has been around for a long time suddenly gained much more traction.
Yeah, and the two developments are closely linked, as we now know. There had always been rumors that the Germans only gave up the Deutschmark in order to win over the French to say yes to unification, and in return they would introduce the euro. I think there's some truth to that, but again, we need to know the full history, what happened. Going back through the 20th century, you can see that Germany experienced two periods of rapid inflation, hyperinflation. They had one big inflation, as we all know, in the Weimar Republic, when you needed billions and trillions of marks to pay for a loaf of bread. And many German savers at the time lost all their savings. And then just a few years later, after 45, they experienced exactly the same again. The old Reichsmark was completely worthless, and they needed another currency cut, introduced the Deutsche Mark. And once again, savers lost out. So the Germans were really twice bitten, and they were a million times shy when it came to inflation. And that's why Germany, after 45, decided to try something new in monetary policy. So they established a new central bank. They gave it complete independence from politics, something that Australia only did a few years ago. And they gave it one sole task. And the task was to ensure price stability. Yeah. And no matter what the cost. And that's actually what they achieved, because they were so afraid of inflation. Inflation is still a big issue in Germany, whether it's 1.5% or 2%, that's always front page stuff. I mean, yes. The Germans follow inflation with the same passion that the Brits follow the weather and the Australians follow house prices.
But that model that was created through the creation of the German Bundesbank, that became so successful that it was emulated everywhere in the Western world. You just mentioned Australia.
But it took a while. Yeah. Actually, what happened first was that the Germans put so much emphasis on price stability, definitely more than other European countries that never had this kind of inflation experience, that it put a lot of pressure on other European countries to devalue their currency against the Deutschmark. Because if you have one central bank, the German Bundesbank, following this price stability at all cost model, and the others are more relaxed, and naturally what happens is that some other currencies will constantly have to devalue against the Deutschmark, and that's naturally humiliating.
And that is what then more and more nation states and member states of the back then European Economic Community resented, that they felt they were kind of ruled from Frankfurt, that is the base of the German Bundesbank, and that was their motivation to Europeanize.
Yeah, exactly. Other European countries, okay, they probably didn't think anymore that Germany posed some kind of military threat, and probably it didn't. But it was seen as an economic bully, because they were really enforcing their own monetary policy, regardless what the others were doing. And so the others had to play by German rules, and the Germans became more and more powerful on the economic front. They had the strongest currency, and the others basically had to follow.
So that embrace that you refer to, that was there at the beginning of the European project, that embrace of Germany by France that would prevent Germany from moving too much or dominating Europe too much, that embrace was suddenly required in relation to the German Bundesbank.
Exactly, right? And when it became clearer and clearer that Germany was dominating the monetary front, especially on the French side, there were movements to just say, okay, maybe we should really introduce a European currency. At least we would get rid of that economic bully. We could contain the Germans once again. Right. Now, of course, the Germans resented that, because they didn't want to follow a French or Italian monetary policy. They wanted to prevent inflation, after all.
Yes.
And they always looked at Italy, and they could see that every time they traveled to Italy on their holiday, it was getting cheaper for them. Because the Italians, of course, had inflation.
But when you say Germans resented it, you are talking about the public opinion.
Oh, absolutely.
But the German elites were very receptive to the idea of an ever closer union. Yes, they were always very committed to Europe. And Helmut Kohl, who was then the Chancellor of Germany, actually willingly accepted the French initiative.
I would not say willingly. No? I think even Germany's elites were quite against the introduction of the euro in the beginning. I mean, certainly the leadership of the Bundesbank, they didn't like the idea at all.
They advised Helmut Kohl against it, and he ignored that advice.
Helmut Kohl had to ignore that advice, because he wouldn't have had any other chance to push through with unification. Yeah. So what happened? basically around 1989, 1990. We all know that François Mitterrand, the French president, resented unification. Maggie Thatcher in Britain certainly opposed it. So why did they oppose it? Because they feared that once Germany was reunited, 82 million people in the center of Europe, they would become too powerful. And then they would have the strongest currency, they would be the biggest country in Europe, and they would just dominate the rest again. And Maggie Thatcher in particular was very fearful. She said, oh, the ugly Germans are back and now they're going to conquer us once again. And so, in a way, to kind of calm the fears of its neighbors, Germany had to give something.
Well, it seemed like a very reasonable response, and in some ways the logic was very much like the one immediately after the Second World War, that Europeans feared Germany that would be too powerful. Even German elites feared Germany that would be too powerful. Then let's Europeanize Germany. We don't want the German Europe, as Thomas Mann said. We want the European Germany. And so the common European currency seemed like the perfect answer to that problem.
First of all, I would say that it was a misjudgment, really, of Germany's interests, because the Germans had no interest, really, in ruling Europe. They were economically powerful, of course, but they had learned their lessons, and they had talked about their past endlessly, and they certainly were not interested at all in dictating anything to anyone. Germany, at the time, really, they would have been content being some larger version of Switzerland, you know, affluent, prosperous, but vigorously uninterested in international affairs. So really, just looking inside. The others didn't believe that, so they demanded from the Germans, you have to give up something. And so there was a secret treaty. And the secret treaty, the German government to the present day denies it. But last year we had the president of the World Bank at a dinner in Sydney, and he gave an interesting speech. And what made it even more interesting was that at the time of unification, he actually led the American delegation in the talks about Germany's unification.
That's Mr. Zöllig?
Yeah, that was Bob Zöllig. And he confirmed from his talks back then that the euro was only introduced because the French would have never said yes to unification otherwise. Yes. And so for the first time, we heard from someone who was actually present at the 1990 talks, the 2+4 talks about Germany's unification, you know, the two Germanys and the four allied forces of the Second World War. And for the first time, one of the participants in these talks actually confirmed that the euro had something to do with unification. I found it utterly fascinating, because nobody had...
We all knew it, but everyone always
We all knew
denied
it. It was one of the worst kept secrets, but finally it was confirmed. And I think it makes eminent sense.
But then there was a compromise that seemed perfectly sensible. That is, I mean, Helmut Kohl, whether willingly or not, accepted that proposition. And then in return...
He had no choice.
In return, Germany managed to persuade its European partners that the model that the whole Europe needs to follow when creating the European Central Bank would be very much the German Bundesbank writ large. That is, again, a very firm commitment to fiscal discipline and targeting inflation. And for the first decade, it really seemed that that was the deal that worked.
Well, the way it happened was the Germans were forced to give up their old beloved Deutschmark and introduced the euro, and the Germans, of course, didn't trust it. The Bundesbank resisted it. In order to make it kind of palatable for the Germans to say yes to that, you at least had to calm their fears. Look, we're introducing a European currency. We know the Deutschmark was always very strong, but nothing to fear here. The new currency, the euro, will be as strong as the mark. Actually, that was what the German treasurer at the time said. Right. He traveled around the country and said, don't fear, no reason to worry. It will be as hard, as tough, as stable as the Deutsche Mark.
And it has been for the first decade.
Yeah, well, in order to calm these fears, they first legislated for this Stability and Growth Pact. So some fiscal rules, deficits no more than 3%, total debt to GDP burden no larger than 60%, some convergence criteria on the way towards monetary union. So the Germans were, well, they were supposed to be convinced by this. And also then to say, okay, we're going to locate the new central bank, the European Central Bank, right in Frankfurt, like your old Bundesbank. It was really just speaking to the Germans, you have got nothing to fear. We will just copy what you have experienced. It was a very successful currency. It's probably the most successful currency that post-war Europe had seen. And therefore, we are actually modeling this new currency on you guys. So don't fear. And of course, the whole thing didn't work. Because what you can do is you can legislate for it. What you can't do is you can't change attitudes towards monetary policy across Europe, because there were different economic cultures. There were different ideas what a currency should actually achieve, what a central bank should do, how independent a central bank should be.
Well, that is where political culture matters, and this is what we are experiencing now. The various political cultures cannot be kind of kept together in one currency Union. So it seems that that old model no longer has credibility, and whatever is on paper no longer works. Yet, we also know that Germans just came up with a more recent initiative, that's the fiscal compact. And that seems to be restating that early commitment, enforcing it even through stricter rules. Mm-hmm. And there was a Parteitag, the gathering of the ruling party in Germany, the Christian Democrats, where one of the delegates said, friends, you know, colleagues, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid about inflation or the political instability. Europe speaks German now, yeah, he said. Would you say that is happening? And then that is perfectly ironic, because a project that was created to subdue Germany, to keep it under European control, paradoxically seems to be resulting in Germany becoming a reluctant hegemonic power. There is no other economic power in Europe that could lead Europe.
Yeah, I would agree that it's ironic. And actually, I wrote this in one of my columns for the Business Spectator, that if François Mitterrand had really known what he would get if he asked the Germans to give up their currency, he would have demanded in 1990 that the Germans have to keep their currency at all costs, because it ended up with exactly the opposite of what he had in mind. He wanted to contain Germany. He wanted to weaken Germany and control it. What he got instead is a Germany that's more powerful than ever. And the Germans didn't even want it. So this whole project of monetary union in order to contain Germany has completely backfired, because the Germans are more powerful than ever, and they are not comfortable with it, and neither is anyone else.
Well, and that's then the question, is it the case that the euro, the common currency, the eurozone, can only survive if Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland become more German, not in the sense of them all speaking German, but simply in the sense that more like German in terms of German political culture that developed after the Second World War, where a strong commitment to the Rechtsstaat, the rule of law, was combined with their commitment to low inflation. And I have recent footage that is taken from the press conference after the most recent summit of ECOFIN, where Olli Rehn, the EU Finance Commissioner, what is it?
Commissioner for Monetary Union.
Sorry, the Commissioner for Monetary Union discusses the Irish situation and simply reminds the Irish that the EU is based on the unanimous kind of commitment to the rules. So Olli Rehn, to be fair to him, he is not from Germany, he is from Finland. But in the sense that that German member of parliament described it, Olli Rehn speaks German because he speaks the language of the rule of law, the language of the Rechtsstaat. Let's have a look at that footage, and then there is a response that comment triggered in Ireland. Have a look at this.
The question relates to a 3.1 billion promissory note payment that the government in Ireland is obliged to make at the end of this month. Because the wider negotiation on the question of the entire bank debt will not be completed by that stage, there are suggestions that the payment due at the end of this month should be postponed or delayed to give the government a little bit of breathing room, or headroom if you like. However, other people are saying that the government should just go ahead and pay the money that is due. I wonder what your view is. Thank you.
I actually wonder why this has to be asked at all, because the principle in the European Union and in the long European legal and historical tradition is in Latin pacta sunt servanda. Respect your commitments and obligations. The European Union is a community of law, and that assumes by definition that each and every member state respects the commitment it has undertaken. And this is valid in the case of Ireland as well. Any possible negotiation on the medium to long-term solution is a separate issue from this. Thank you.
That was a very short exchange. He just said the European Union is the community of the rule of law. It was about the payments that are due to failed to the bondholders of failed Irish banks. Under normal circumstances, if Ireland was an independent country, that would be a political challenge for the Irish government, what to do with it, but as Ireland is a part of the Eurozone, Ireland is not free to decide for itself, so it was up to the EU Commissioner to tell Ireland what to do. Now you can imagine, this was a very short comment, seemed quite innocent, but you can imagine what reactions it triggered in Ireland, and I have two examples from RT Radio, from their podcast last week. Listen to this.
Pacta sunt servanda, he insisted. Senator David Norris was not impressed.
Pacta sunt servanda, which we all know, roughly translated, means croppies lie down.
So Greece got a debt write-off, Spain got a concession, and independent TD Shane Ross wasn't taking Ollie Rehn's rebuke at all well during leaders' questions in the Dáil on Wednesday.
He went on to tick us off in Latin, no less, about our obligations. Now, before he breaks into Latin, I suggest he should brush up on his Greek, because Greece was the first exception to the rule that he was making yesterday. Spanish was the second exception to the rule. And the danger I see here is this, that when we're entering the fiscal treaty, we're entering into a kind of a la carte Europe, where the big countries and the malingerers are being allowed to pick and choose where they're going to breach the treaty and where they're going to be made exceptions of. But where Ireland, and Hungary indeed, are going to be at the poor man's table, at the table d'hôte table. And they're not going to be able to do that. We're going to do what we're told by Ollie Rehn.
I love this, because that vignette to me shows in a marvelous way what is the problem with that common currency. That is, the problems that Europe faces today, the problem that Europe faces today is not a technocratic problem that can be solved by technocrats like Olli Rehn. These are political problems. And to me, that contrast between Olli Rehn's response, that was simply to remind people that rules have to be obeyed, and a much more lively engagement in the Irish Parliament, which is very much in the tradition of the Westminster system, that's much more confrontation, couldn't be bigger. In fact, the first senator referred to croppies lie down. He mistranslated that phrase. It's a legal phrase that simply says that rules have to be obeyed, and he mistranslated it as croppies lie down, and I suspect that very few Australians understand that, because it's an Irish term. I had to Google it to find out that it goes back to the revolution of 1798, yeah? And again, that is, in an open political contestation in Ireland, you can make those references. In Europe, it's impossible. The point that the senator made was that it's humiliating for Ireland to accept those conditions. Both senators made that point. Do you fear a growing anti-EU or indeed anti-German sentiment that is now pushing the nations of Europe apart from each other?
Yeah, I think it's quite obvious that we are seeing this. We had last year the Deputy Prime Minister in Greece making some remarks to that effect, where he said the Germans stole our gold in the Second World War, and now they just have to give us some money to make up for that. Now we're getting these remarks out of Ireland. Last year, the Irish complained that the Germans were sending them Treasury officials to have a look at their data, and they found that absolutely insulting and humiliating. And neither Ireland nor Greece were particularly hostile in the last 50 years towards Germany. In fact, they were quite close, they were friendly. And now you can see that this great project of monetary union is actually driving these countries apart. So Angela Merkel likes to talk a lot about war and peace, that the euro is a question of war and peace, and the whole survival of the European Union is a question of war and peace. And in order to save Europe and save European integration and common understanding, you have to do everything to keep that monetary union as it is. Actually, I think it's quite the opposite. By keeping the monetary union together, they are actually sowing the seeds of further hostility. I think it would be far easier for the Greeks just to depart from the Eurozone, reintroduce the drachma, have a proper default, not that kind of default in homeopathic doses, because otherwise I think you're just enforcing this confrontation with Germany, and you see a lot of anti-German sentiment. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help the Germans, it doesn't help the Greeks. They should really find a completely different approach to that.
But you just referred to Greece, and of course all these developments are interconnected. So would you, for example, advocate also for Ireland to exit from the Eurozone, for Spain, for Portugal, in fact Italy? Where will it end?
Ireland's a different case because Ireland,
So
I
they
think,
should stay in the Eurozone.
well, if one of the crisis countries can stay, it's Ireland.
Yes.
Because Ireland is already making good progress reforming. They went down the hard path of what economists call internal devaluation.
Yes.
So they're actually cutting prices, wages, pensions, and so on.
But that exchange just showed that Irish now feel that they are being penalized for having lived up to the expectations that were imposed on them by the outsiders, the way those critical comments perceived it. And the question is then...
Can we just go back maybe 10 years? Because I think I wouldn't even agree with you that the euro first worked quite well. Okay. And I wouldn't agree that the initial growth or stability and growth pact really worked. And I think Ireland is the perfect example to show why it didn't work.
Yes.
Because if you just look at the situation that Europe was in 2007, 2008, when the GFC really began, Ireland was in a good shape. Ireland had enormous economic growth for about a decade or even longer. They had reformed their public finances. Irish debt to GDP was, I think, around 20% at the time. So Ireland looked really healthy.
They consistently had surpluses, of course.
They were perfect. Ireland did actually live by the rules of the old Stability and Growth Pact. So Ireland was never a problem. But in the Irish case, I think you could still see why the euro didn't work for them, despite having that growth, despite having this enviable fiscal record. Because Ireland only had these growth rates, or partially had these growth rates, I should say, because they benefited from a European monetary policy which simply didn't reflect their circumstances. Remember, Germany and France in the early years of the century were going through a rough economic period.
That's right, that's right.
High unemployment in France and Germany, sluggish economic growth, and the European Central Bank reflected that in their monetary policy.
That's right. It was not worried about the housing boom
exactly.
in
so
Ireland.
What happened was that the European Central Bank took a very active role and lowered interest rates to encourage growth in France and in Germany at a time when it was booming in Ireland anyway. Yeah. And so what they were actually doing, they were creating interest rates that were in real terms, if you take into account inflation, negative for Ireland. So you were borrowing money and the banks actually paid you for taking that money. So you didn't pay interest really. And of course, what it led to in Ireland was a housing boom, a construction boom, a big bubble, and that burst in 2007-8. So what you can see is that growth and stability pact that really exclusively focused on public finances didn't work for Ireland, because that's just part of the equation. You would also have to look at other factors. You would have to look at what's happening in asset markets, what's happening in the property market. And therefore, Ireland was actually then eventually punished for something that they really didn't choose for themselves.
And to make matters worse, as now transpired, the European Central Bank actually pressurized the Irish politicians at the height of the crisis to take on obligations that the Irish state.
But that's where the whole policy is wrong, and I think that's where the fiscal compact is wrong.
Just one aspect of that dispute, and that is the point that that Senator Shane Ross made, was about double standards, that you cannot tell the Irish that they should abide by the rules when you just told the Greeks that they no longer need to abide by the rules, and when you just suggested to the Spaniards that the rules can be changed. And isn't that going to the heart of the European project, and that is a textbook wisdom that even Olli Rehn restated? It is about this supranational legal order that was erected there. But if you have the same set of rules...
But that's nothing new for Europe. Okay. Europe has never really played by its own rules. Look at Ireland again. Ireland had 2 referenda on treaties, because by a ruling of the Irish Supreme Court going back to 1987, the Irish are bound to put treaties concerning the European Union and Ireland's membership in the European Union to a public referendum. Now, they did that with the Treaty of Nice in 2001, and it failed. And they did it again with the Lisbon Treaty in 2008, and it failed again. And in both cases, 1 year later, the Irish were actually called back to vote a second time. Yeah. So the European Union graciously gave them a second chance to get it right. And the Irish got it right. And they voted exactly as the EU demanded, because otherwise they would have been punished. So does that mean that the European Union is playing by its own rules of being a democratic community, committed to democratic values, if you just let them vote again and again until you get the result you want? Was it playing by the rules when the French and the Germans could be in complete violation of that growth and stability treaty in 2002, 2003, and were not punished for that? Nobody was playing by the rules in Europe.
Perhaps one could say that at least in the first couple of decades of European integration, the legal order that was erected there was pretty solid, and perhaps after the Treaty of Maastricht it got messier. But I'm anxious because the time is running out, and I want our audience to get involved in this conversation. So I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. We have covered a lot. There is much more that I want to ask you, but we'll see what our audience is interested in. Other questions or comments to Oliver? Yes?
I just had a question. I was in Germany recently, and it seems like a lot of German, or many German people are very annoyed and indignant towards the Greeks because they have to help the bailout. But also heard the argument that Germany promoted Greek borrowing to have markets for its manufacturing, and it promoted like these countries, Spain and Greece, to grow its market for manufacturing. And now that it has to help it out because it got into debt with its creditors, it's saying it's the Greeks' fault.
On your first point, yes, sure, the Germans are annoyed, they don't want to pay. For the past more than 2 decades, Germany had enormous transfers towards the east. About 4% of Germany's GDP every year is transferred from West Germany to East Germany to build it up. And now they're afraid that they're repeating that experience with other countries. But now the money is not going to East Germany, but to Greece and Portugal and Ireland, and maybe Italy. So they're afraid of that. And there are calculations that if it comes to that dreaded fiscal union, transfer union, that Germany would probably have to pay about 50 or 60 billion euros each year to other countries. And I mean, you can imagine it's not popular. Of course not. On the second question, I don't quite buy it, actually, because if you think about it this way, Greece is a tiny market. Greece is 2.2% of the Eurozone's economy. Really, they could disappear from the face of the earth tomorrow and Germany wouldn't really notice it. It's a country that is about half the size of the German state of Hessen. So it doesn't matter that much to the Germans. But you're right in one way, because the Germans are hypocrites, let's face it. The Germans are benefiting from monetary union in a number of ways, not perhaps through directly exporting to Greece. I mean, they could probably do without. But there are so many other ways in which Germany currently benefits from the euro crisis. Because so far the Germans haven't paid anything. They always say that they don't want to pay, but actually, well, so far they haven't. So far they've given credit to Greece. They have lent them money and they get interest payments for that. So the Germans actually borrow that money. They hardly have to pay anything for the borrowing because they're seen as a safe haven, so they can borrow in markets at ridiculous interest rates. Actually, the last time the German treasurer issued a bond for half a year money, he got negative interest rates. So investors actually had to pay for the pleasure of lending to the German government because that was seen as one of the last safe havens. So the Germans get free money, lend it to Greece and get interest from Greece back. Perfect, nice deal.
But it's a very risky enterprise, of course.
Of course it's a risky enterprise, but they're benefiting in a number of ways. They're benefiting, for example, from a subdued exchange rate. So the euro exchange rate, if it only reflected Germany, would be much higher. But it is lower because of Greece, because of Portugal, because of Italy, and therefore German exporters are celebrating. They can export to China and to Brazil and to India.
Celebrating if they want to buy a BMW, it's much cheaper than it would be.
It is much cheaper. So actually Germany's exports are at record highs. Germany's unemployment is at record low. Germany's overall employment is at record high. Germany had 3% growth for the past 2 years. All fine. And on top of all of that, to make it even better for the Germans, the European Central Bank doesn't dare to lift interest rates up because if Germany grows at 3% and the official ECB cash rate is 1%, that means for Germany it's way too low. So we're now exactly in the reverse situation where Germany was at the beginning of the century. Now they are like Ireland early on. Now they're getting the cheap interest rates that reflect the others.
But they are sitting at the top of a volcano. You just mentioned the unemployment rates in Germany about 5%, in Spain 20%, in Greece 20%, in Spain among young people up to 25.
Yes. That was a very
50%.
roundabout answer to the question, but the thing is actually that the Germans have taken on so many commitments, but they're long-term. And I mean, the moment the whole thing falls apart, it will be extremely costly to the Germans and it will really backfire mightily. And then it will become extremely unpopular, even more unpopular than it is at the moment. But for the time being, the Germans are actually pretty well off. They're benefiting. Let me just add one thing, and that's one factor that I just encourage you to look it up because it's utterly fascinating, I think. There is a hidden euro crisis that nobody talks about, or very few people really understand. And you can Google it. It's called Target 2. You probably never heard of it before, but this is the biggest crisis of them all. It is worth more than €500 billion, and it is something that could blow up any minute. I have to explain this. Give me 2 minutes, and I'll be very brief and make it very simple. But basically what happened in the pre-crisis era, German banks were funding the whole periphery of Europe, and they were giving them credit because the periphery of Europe, so Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal, they constantly imported more than they exported. That's fine, you can do that, that's okay. But what you need, conversely, is somebody to pay for that. And so every country that has this negative balance, they need to import capital. And the way to import capital is to basically get credit from richer countries. And so the Germans, they exported to the rest of Europe, but they also provided the capital so the others could pay for their imports. Now in 2007, what happened? That all dried up. Suddenly banks were realizing that there's something like risk in markets that before that they had completely forgotten. And when that capital flow really ebbed away in 2007, the European central banking system jumped in. And I make it very simple. If you have a German exporter delivering a tractor to Greece, it takes a lot of bank transactions because the Greek importer needs to turn to his bank and the bank needs to give him credit. The bank actually needs to get that money for the credit somewhere, but they couldn't access it anymore. So in the end, they had to turn to the Greek central bank. The Greek central bank effectively printed virtual money. And so the money was passed on, virtually printed money, from Greece to Germany via the Bundesbank to the bank of the tractor producer and ended up in the tractor producer's accounts. But in return, in this whole process, the German Bundesbank was building up massive positions against Greece and the other countries and the euro system. And to the present day, the rest of Europe now owes Germany more than 500 billion euros. And that's a technicality, and as long as the euro stays together, that's fine, it's okay, you can deal with that. It doesn't hurt the Germans at the moment. But the moment that Greece departs the eurozone, nobody can recover that. And if Greece departs, this will cost the Germans about 27 billion euros, because that's their share. Greece alone owes about 100 billion under this Target 2 system. But if Germany one day decides, we've had enough, we're pulling out, because we don't want this anymore, and actually we can't even finance it anymore, because our Bundesbank is now broke, that will cost them more than $500 billion, and then good luck to the Germans, because they can't recover this money.
How much is $500 billion in proportion to the overall GDP of Germany? That would be quite significant.
It is quite significant. Well, Germany's official debt burden currently is around 2.1 trillion.
Yes, yes.
So, and that's equivalent to about 82% of GDP.
Yes,
so add another 20%.
20%. Amazing.
And you would have to recapitalize the German Bundesbank, because the moment the Bundesbank is broke, Germany's banking system is also broke.
So, I mean, to summarize it very simply, right now, up to date, Germany hasn't paid a cent. But once the whole thing implodes, Germany will be the primary...
That's the critical issue for Germany here, because the Germans are currently feeling relatively at ease. They don't like that payment. Okay, fine. But actually, at the moment, they're not really paying anyway. And they think that, I mean, if you visit Germany, you probably would have experienced that Germany looks all right. I mean, the trains run more or less on time, and it's clean, and the rubbish is collected. Unemployment is low. You can easily find a job. The Germans think that
cities are much more exciting than any number of cities.
But anyway, the Germans really don't get the urgency of the crisis because they are doing fine. But they're only doing fine because the rest is struggling so much. Once the crisis actually turns and reaches Germany, the whole thing will collapse and it will become extremely ugly.
Other questions or comments? You can go outside of Germany. Yes?
I'll stay with Germany, but you mentioned earlier that Germany was the only country which really identified with being European. Would you argue that every member of the EU would have to feel that European identity as well if it was really to succeed?
In a way, yes. I mean, there's an old discussion about whether Europe could ever be a democracy. Because democracy, the word actually means demos, people, and kratos, power. So what you need for democracy to work is you need a people first. It's not enough just to have power structures. It's not enough to have a parliament, a European Commission, European courts. You actually need a people to make this work. And what does a people mean? A people is more than people living together in some geographically defined space. It means more. It means a public opinion. It means people actually discussing their common affairs. It needs a national press, for example, leading this discussion. Nothing is present of that would really together form a people on the European level. There is no common European discourse. There are lots of national discussions, like the Irish discussion. It was quite interesting, actually, because I think in Germany nobody would have really noticed what the Irish were discussing. And how
they wouldn't have understood it.
No,
anyway.
They wouldn't have understood the idiom anyway.
Yeah.
Nobody would have followed these debates. Nobody would have understood the outrage. And that's, I think, why you can't make this European democracy work. Because I mean, sometimes you need these big political debates where the whole country discusses an issue and then comes to some sort of conclusion after a few years. In Europe, that never happens because you have very separate national discourses and you don't have the elements that you really need to constitute a real democracy. So I think, yeah, okay, theoretically, if everybody was suddenly European, if everybody started to speak just one language and everybody read the same kind of newspapers and watched the same TV news, maybe that would work. I would argue it would be undesirable because the good thing about Europe is actually the cultural diversity. I wouldn't want to abolish that. So I'm afraid I think this wouldn't work, and it wouldn't be desirable. It wouldn't be the Europe that actually was the Europe that was lively and culturally diverse. It would be some kind of unified, uniform, Brussels-like, top-down Europe, and that's not the kind of Europe that I would like to see.
This is what Europe was, as it was a community of nations before the Treaty of Maastricht. There is one more question that we can take, and I think, Andrew, you wanted to ask a question. Is it related to the picture you sent us?
Not really, but I just wanted to know, obviously, in the European media, Angela Merkel's quite often portrayed, and as you sort of said, she has the famous saying that if Greece fails, then Europe and the European Union fails. Realistically, we are not seeing many positive things about Greece. Obviously, the bailout packages is just to cover a temporary thing. Obviously, it's not going to do anything. And there are obviously signs that Greece should pull out of the euro and should introduce the drachma. Now, do you think that's a good decision that Greece pulls out and goes back to the drachma? And if it does, how easy is it to convert from the euro back to drachma?
I just want to put up a slide that Andrew kindly sent us that is related indirectly to it because it's about the political tension that is growing between Germany and Greece. And the Spectator magazine has this outrageous advertisement campaign. Most Germans own a second property. It's called Greece. I mean, your question is more technical, and you might want to wish to address both. To me, they are related because Greece cannot regain control over its destiny within the Eurozone.
First of all, that is, of course, a Spectator, and I love the Spectator, but it's a British magazine. And it's a British conservative magazine. And the British conservatives never liked the euro from the beginning, and they were always fearful of the Germans.
And they were proven right, of course.
Of course they were right. But it's some kind of Schadenfreude.
Yes.
So, okay, forget about the Spectator, apart from that great magazine. Question about Greece. Yes, and in fact, I think we discussed it 2 years ago. I've always said for the past 2 years that Greece has to depart because there is no place for a country like Greece in the Eurozone because it's bad for Greece, because it doesn't help them. As long as a cappuccino costs you €4.50 in Athens, you will struggle to get tourists back to Athens because your tourist euro will get you a lot further if you just spend it in Croatia or in Turkey or in Bulgaria. I think
or in Macedonia.
Or in Macedonia, indeed. There is no point, really, for Greece to try to keep within the Eurozone because it has no chance of recovery. Now, how to take Greece out of the Eurozone? Well, of course, I wouldn't start from here.
1 minute left, Oliver.
I wouldn't start from here. I would have done it 2 years earlier. Instead of giving them the bailout packages in May 2010, I would have decided back then that they should leave because you were just throwing good money after bad. But you can do it. I think the most likely scenario that we're going to see for Greece is that Greece will pull out the moment that they can basically get by without international support, and they are reaching that point as soon as they have a primary budget surplus. That may happen sometime in the next year, and at that stage, they will probably reintroduce their own currency. By the way, I also think that at that stage, they will finally declare a proper default, and it is possible for them even to convert some part of the debt into the new currency, because what most people don't know, 95% of Greek debt, government debt, is actually issued under Greek law, which allows them unilaterally to redefine the currency under which it is repaid. So the Greek government has every right to say, well, sorry folks, but we just converted everything into drachmas and we're going to repay you in a drachma, and by the way, that's just been devalued. So it's possible. And I think that's the path we're going to see. And it doesn't make sense to keep them in the euro. Angela Merkel may talk about war and peace as much as she likes, but she doesn't help Greece.
So Greece will be out by 2013, and we have to finish this right now. But are you so bold as to say, yes, 2013,
by the end
whole
of
map
2013,
of Europe will have changed significantly?
I think that a Greek departure is almost inevitable. The problem with Europe is it's a political project. Poor economists like myself, we struggle making predictions because we are too rational for these debates.
That's right.
There are politicians making these decisions, and we have seen what happens when you put them in charge.
Thank you. Dr. Oliver Hartwich, Center for Independent Studies, Sydney. Thank you very much.
Thank you.